Welcome back, everyone. This is my first sit-down video in a very long time. Been pretty much hiking videos for quite a while, but this video is kind of still a hiking video because here I will be reviewing and ranking and hopefully giving a little bit of a guide to every one of the 13,000 foot peaks in Rocky Mountain National Park and the Indian Peaks Wilderness in northern Colorado. So this is all of the 13ers in the general region of northern Colorado. It's a really cool collection of peaks, I think. It ended up fitting very well for like a video sort of tier list kind of format. So there are 25 different summits, 26, 25, something like that. Um, and I will be ranking all of them, giving my personal thoughts on them, giving some just guidance and tips of if you want to climb these mountains. And yeah, just kind of laying out my thoughts and what were my favorites, what were my least favorites, etc. And I should say right off the bat, if you're like me, any day spent in the mountains is a 10 out of 10 day. And so, just because one peak's going in A tier and another peak, just because a peak might end up in D tier does not mean that it wasn't worthwhile doing. It was, all of these peaks were awesome. I had fun on all of them. I did great, spectacular views on every one of them. This is just relative to each other. So the goal here is that hopefully if you're a local to the area or you're just visiting or whatever it is, and you want some big summit to go climb, while you have the chance, this is hopefully a recommendation set as well that will help you kind of figure out which one is, what I might want to do, what's within my skill level, all of that. So yeah, I hope it ends up to be helpful. A couple of preliminaries, of course. Um, None of these hikes are easy. All of them, I would subjectively say are very difficult. There's probably one exception to that rule that I wouldn't put quite so high that we'll talk about. But all of these hikes are very difficult. They take all day to complete, and I would really highly recommend just a strong level of fitness, a high level of fitness, and especially if you're doing these in the summer, start early, be off the peak by noon, dodge thunderstorms, bring everything you might need if you have to spend a night in the back country above tree line. All of that sort of basic safety stuff. So that's just a couple of the things, but I'll just kind of assume that if you're interested in this, you'll be sufficiently experienced, and you should be sufficiently experienced to with all of those things before attempting one of these mountains because they are I I don't know. I don't think I would say any of them was an easy climb. Maybe with the exception of one that I'm thinking of. But yeah, we'll get into it. And so with that aside, I'll break down a little bit of the criteria that I kind of use to judge and place these peaks in their respective tiers. There's kind of four main areas I'm getting at. So first of all, what's the climbing like? Is it fun to climb this mountain in terms of, say, is there a lot of fun scrambling involved? Is there a lot of bushwhacking, which is not so fun, that sort of thing? What's the actual experience of getting your body up to the summit of this thing? So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is summit views. How does it look on top of the summit? And like I said before, all of these peaks have fantastic views from the top. So it's really comparing them relative to each other. But I think, it's still fair to say that some peaks certainly have better summit views than others, and we'll get more into that as we go. The third I'm saying is approach, which is, when I talk about approach, I mean, how long would it take you to get to the summit? Some of these are, some of the easier ones of these are maybe just a couple of miles up to the summit and maybe even less than 10 miles round trip in some cases. Other mountains that are way up in the boonies are more like 20 miles round trip and 5,000, 6,000 feet of elevation gain in a day. So much, much longer, much, much harder. There's a lot of variability in that. So that's another criteria to note. And the last one I'm saying, which is related to the previous one, is overall difficulty. How hard is it to get up and, of course, down this mountain? As the saying goes, getting to the summit is optional and coming down is mandatory. So that's another safety point to always keep in mind when you're doing this stuff in the backcountry. And a final note before we get into the rankings, I wanted to just give a brief lowdown of some of the terminology I'll be using. So if you're familiar with the Yosemite decimal system, that's just a system of ranking the difficulty in terms of technical skill it takes to ascend a peak. So it goes from class 1 to class 5 is how this goes. So class 1 is easy trail hiking, class 2 is off trail hiking, walking over tundra or boulder hopping. Class 3 is you need to use your hands and your feet, your whole body to ascend. Class 4 is similar, but just normally steeper, more exposure, more danger, risk of falling, that sort of thing. And finally, class 5 is technical rock climbing where you'd be roped up. So it's just a very brief overview. You could look up the Yosemite Decimal System if you want to learn more about that. All of the climbs in this list of peaks, they can all be kept to class 3 or easier. So none of them require technical ropes, technical climbing, any of that stuff. There are a lot of routes on a lot of these peaks which do use those sorts of things, but if you're talking about the easiest way to get to the summit, none of them require any sort of technical gear, technical knowledge. There's definitely a couple that require a bit of a stomach for exposure and heights, so keep that in mind. But I just wanted to make that quick note because you'll hear me saying this quite frequently, class 1, class 3, whatever. So just a primer on what that means. With all of that long preliminary said, let's finally get into the list and the ranking. So here we are. I've got my map on the left here and the tier list website on the right. So on the left, this is a topographic map, a topo map. This specifically application is Gaia GPS, which if you spend a lot of time in the outdoors and tracking routes and stuff, you're probably familiar with this app. But just to get us situated of where we're at here. So here's Denver, as you can see, the largest city in Colorado. And the peaks we'll be looking at all follow the Continental Divide as it trends northward up through starting around I-70, which you can see down there, and north through Rocky Mountain National Park. So that's kind of the crest of the northern front range that is very visible, really dominates the skyline of the populated areas on the front range. So just to set that in broad context, and we will get into the first set of peaks, which is actually not in the Indian Peaks or Rocky Mountain National Park, as it turns out. But I wanted to throw this little loop in there as a honorable mention. And one thing I forgot to mention beforehand is that I have videos of every single one of these 13ers on my channel here. So I'll try to leave a link to my 13ers playlist in the description below if you want to check that out. Just be warned that some of the earlier videos are much lower quality than, at least in my opinion, much lower quality than the more recent ones I've been putting out. And I climbed a fair number of these peaks as sort of my first high summits when I was first getting into doing this YouTubing, making videos about the outdoors and mountains sort of thing. So bear that in mind again, that there's a huge hugely variable in quality and cinematography from my comparing my earlier and my later videos of some of those. But I do have videos for every one of the 13ers that I'm going to mention. So if you want to see more about a particular hike, go check that in the description. And yeah, hopefully that's helpful to you to get a bit of a visual thing of what things look like. When I do those videos, I don't set out to create like a hiking guide explaining where exactly you want to go. I typically just prefer to show my experience when I go in the outdoors. But I think that could be helpful nonetheless if you are looking into climbing any of these mountains. So with that, let's finally get into the first peak, or really the first set of peaks, because this is what I'm calling the James Peak Wilderness Loop. So there are actually five 13ers, and this is getting a little squished here. Um, but I'll just give you an idea of this is the sort of distance ascent amount of time that it took me to do this sort of peak. So this is a really serious day, I would say. Most of these 13ers are going to turn out to be very serious days. Um, full day hikes, like I said, but I'll just try to click and you can pause and look kind of the stats of how long each route took. And so that's that loop right there. And you can see it in the red here. So this is a separate wilderness area, the James Peak Wilderness Area, the namesake of which is James Peak, which is one of the first 13er on this list right here. And so the way I did this, so you can see this is close to I-70. So I'm also going to provide a little bit of information about trailheads and stuff when it's relevant. Most of these peaks are very easy to access for any passenger car, they're trailheads. So I wouldn't generally worry about that. Though for this specific road, this one I might actually recommend a four-wheel drive vehicle. For this, you could probably get up with some careful and careful two-wheel driving. I think you could probably get up this road to start here. I have a Subaru Outback, so that has four-wheel drive capabilities, and it served me very well for these sorts of things. But there's where I started this is this on so this is called the Rainbow Road, and there are some pull-offs on this little section just below 10,200 feet where I parked. There's a couple of sites to camp if you want to, and that's on National Forest land, I believe. So that's free. You can just pull up and do your thing. And so that's where I started. And the nice thing about starting there is that it made this really aesthetic loop design. So I could, start. I started by heading up to the north here, and this is entirely on the CDT, the Continental Divide Trail. So it's a very well-maintained trail to get to the summit of James Peak, and then from there I was able to kind of traverse and come off trail and hit four other 14ers or 13ers, excuse me, for a total of five 13ers on the day. So I would say this was like 95% class two sort of off trail um, talus hiking, boulder hopping, tundra walking sort of stuff. The one exception, there is a little bit of class three scrambling that you can optionally do on this little ridge here. This is between James Peak and Mount Bancroft. And I say it's optional because if you get late enough in the year, the snowfield that kind of accumulates on the leeward side of the Continental Divide here starts to melt, and then you could actually probably keep it class two by sort of sticking to this side. But I actually did this in June, so the snow was all still packed in. So to avoid the snow, I was forced to stay on the ridge and do some class three climbing. But it was quite fun class three climbing. It was fairly solid. Yeah, just a lot of fun. But that was the only class three hands and feet required section of that entire hike. The whole rest of this is just class two. So you take the CDT up to James Peak, then you hit Mount Bancroft, and then it's a very short little hop over to Perry Peak, which is the high point of the route. And then the next one is Mount Eva, and the fifth and final one is Mount Flora over there, which actually has a trail coming up from the other side if you want to get that as well. But the off-trail section basically goes on the crest of the Continental Divide here. So that's all class two boulder hopping, tundra walking sort of stuff from James Peak all the way down to Mount Flora. And then once you hit Mount Flora, then you actually hook up with the CDT again and loop all the way back down to where you parked right there. So I thought this was a really aesthetic, nice loop hike to just get five 13ers. I did this in June of 2024. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I just like the fact that you can kind of close it together. The views of these some of these are natural lakes, but most of these are nat or dams that were put in many, many years ago. So most of those are artificial lakes. But yeah, the views were very nice. These peaks have a fair bit of glaciation, not quite as much as we'll see in the future, but very cool nonetheless. So I think the first ranking I will give to it here is the B tier. So let's see if I can find the image that I use for this. Here it is. So this is the image for the James Peak Loop, and I'll try to annotate this image with the respective peaks in order, and then share that in the description. So they're not just random pictures of random rubble piles or whatever. So that's James Peak goes in B tier. So that's the I'm just grouping all five of these particular peaks together because I did them as one day hike and one big loop, and they're technically outside of the realm of interest that I stated in this video originally, which we are now moving into as we move into the first 13ers of the Indian Peaks Wilderness. And the first one I'm going to talk about, I'm just doing this from south to north, as you can tell. But the first one here is Old Baldy, which is kind of like a sub peak. It's hard to really call it a peak in its own right. I actually did this with in conjunction with South Arapaho in 2023. So I just sort of took it up as a side trip. It's a very easy side trip to do, but it's really not the star of the show of these particular of this particular cluster of peaks here, which are definitely the South and North Arapaho peaks. But it's a nice little spot. I think it's kind of just basically a class two walk up. There's a trail all the way to the saddle, a good trail here, and then you're going to be on some easy class two tundra walking to actually get to the summit here. Um, I would say I would probably put this peak in C tier. Um, it might be more interesting if it were on its own, but the walk up, the approach is not super compelling in terms of again relative to everything else. It's beautiful, of course. I think the one thing that keeps it out of D tier is the incredible view you get uh, of the Arapaho peaks right here. So this is Arapaho Glacier, which I believe is the largest glacier in Colorado. And so it's a spectacular view of these glacially carved peaks and this basin that goes all the way down, just a very an incredibly beautiful area. And but I will move on to the real stars of the show here, which is the South and North Arapaho peaks. So South Arapaho, I would say, is a once you get up in the trail here, this is all class one, just a normal trail. Once you start to branch off, I would start calling this class two. It is a fairly steep ascent here to get up to South Arapaho. I would say this, what is that, 600 or so feet here. Um, but I think it remains entirely at class two, despite how steep it is. So I'm going to be ranking South Arapaho on its own, and I'm going to be putting it in B tier. Let's see if I can find it. Here it is. So we'll put South Arapaho in B tier. And yeah, I think this mountain doesn't really stand on its own because of its higher neighbor, which I'm about to talk about. But again, I think the uh, the views from this peak are again just spectacular. I think anywhere in the really almost anywhere, but in this region of the Indian Peaks in particular, just has a just a slight touch above almost all of the rest of the other places we'll talk about in this video. And next up, we have North Arapaho Peak. This peak is just so awesome in every single way. It's going to be the first A tier. So here it is. And that is going to be the first peak in the A tier, North Arapaho Peak. And the reason for this is, all of the aforementioned stuff, the views, the glacier, everything. But the real factor that makes it stand apart is this traverse between South and North Arapaho Peaks. This is a mostly class three traverse with one class four move. So I guess I lied earlier. There is one class four move required to get to one of these peaks, but it's fairly mild by class four standards. So don't worry about it too much. But once you get off of South Arapaho, you're kind of looking at a little bit of class two, and then quickly it gets into class three, sort of scrambling over rocks and ridges, that territory, especially if you want to stay on the ridge proper, which you should because it's the most fun. I think this is got to be my top five of the most favorite scrambles that I've ever done anywhere, period. It's so much fun. The rock is really solid and it just lends itself to a lot of fun, full body movement, action for this entire way across. I did this in, let's see, I think it was late June. I did this little traverse, and there was a lot of snow on the leeward, the east side of the Continental Divide right here. But on the ridge itself, the ridge proper, it was basically snow free. There was one little chute here towards the end as you're coming up um, to the summit of North Arapaho that had some snow in it that if it were a lot more snowed in than it was, it'd probably be kind of tricky, and might want some ice tools to deal with it. But beyond that, I think it was a fine time of year to do it, and obviously later into the year too. So, yeah, I think North Arapaho is one of the top five mountains I've climbed anywhere, like anywhere, period. Um, Not just even in this particular list that I'm in this video today. So highly, highly recommend, can't recommend this little traverse more. The nice thing about it too is in terms of approach, it's very easy, or relatively easy. Again, I mean, you start at just below 10,200 feet. So, it's a little over 3,000 feet of elevation gain to get to North Arapaho, which is uh, really, that's fairly tame by the standards that we're going to see today for most of these mountains. So that's really nice, and it's all trailed, and I think I'd like to say it's around. I don't have the exact mileage here because this track includes a little bit of extra, but I would say it's probably around 11 or 12 miles round trip. So totally doable. If you're fast, it wouldn't even take you all day. And yeah, just a blast. It's just a blast. So can't recommend this one more. First A tier of the day, one of my favorites that I've ever done. Okay, so as we continue to move northwards, now we're going to talk about you know, a couple of peaks that have a little bit of controversy around them, I would say. So this is Arikari and Kiowa Peak. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing those correctly. These are notorious as the forbidden fruit of the Front Range 13ers, and the reason for this is because they lie in the City of Boulder watershed, which is does not allow hikers, basically is totally prohibited from any recreational activity in this watershed. The city of Boulder took possession of this area over a century ago, I think, which was really before wilderness and conservation movements really got going. So, they're sitting on this land basically, and there's not much you can do about it. So, I have not actually climbed these two peaks myself. There are people who do. It does involve trespassing on the watershed. Uh, I don't know, what would you call it, property or whatever, but you know, if you're sneaky and maybe you have a full moon or something, maybe you can get to certain places, not officially endorsing anything here by any stretch, but I wouldn't necessarily have a problem if you happen to find yourself atop one of these 13ers. But I honestly have not climbed these peaks. I'm not even lying to cover my butt or anything. I have not, so I'm not going to speak on them. They're technically not in the Indian Peaks wilderness, but my understanding is that both of these are kind of class two boulder hopping, and the general route that, well, I won't say anymore. You can look those up if you're really um, uh, if you're really gun ho about climbing all of these 13ers. Those are really the only people who come out and do these peaks because they're totally off trail because it's technically illegal to climb them. But I just thought I would mention that, and now let's move on. Next up, another one of my favorites, Navajo Peak. So this is the route it looks like, and wish I could show more of this at once, but that's kind of what the route looks like. So this is the first of a couple peaks that start in the Brainard Lakes Recreation Area, which, oh gosh, that's one of the busiest areas in the entire Front Range, so much so that it's actually really heavily permitted. You actually need parking reservations in advance to even park at the trailheads in this area, which is really, really annoying. Um, so, um, yeah, I actually have never gotten a reservation to park in any of these particular trailheads that are very close to the peaks, but there is a further trailhead a few miles down the road. This trailhead right here, the Brainerd Lake Area Winter Trailhead, and this is the one that I've always parked at when I want to climb any of the peaks in here. It does add some miles to your approach, certainly, but if either you can't get a reservation or you're just like me, you're too cheap to do it, then that is your best bet. And the nice thing is this road is still paved all the way up. So what I've done before is actually just um, parked at the trailhead and then ridden my bike up and just, locked it up here and then from there started hiking. So that's another option you can also do that you don't need a permit to do that to cut down on some of the the amount of time you have to spend walking. But with that said, if you do get a permit, all of these peaks for the most part in terms of the overall mileage and elevation gain are fairly mild, but starting at the lower trailhead certainly increases the mileage a fair bit. But with that out of the way, let's get back into Navajo Peak. So there are a couple ways you can go up this. Really only two ways. But what I decided to do is just link these two ways together by first going up Niwa Ridge, I believe is how you pronounce that. So there's a trail going up here, and then there's some interesting research stations there, some scientific instrumentation going on. They run some high altitude experiments on this particular ridge. And once you get up here, you can follow this up, and it's pretty much, I would say, there's even like a bit of a faint road up to this point right here at just above 12.2, which I don't know, you could probably call it class one, but it's maybe easy class two-ish, but it's basically tundra walking with some a little bit of rocky terrain. But once you pass this little high point here and then continue on to the ridge proper, it pretty quickly gets into class two territory with no trail. So the trail ends at this point, and now you're following this ridge. And I couldn't tell you exactly where it takes place, but at some point, once it gets steeper in here, you get into class three scrambling territory. But I never found the scrambling on this to be particularly difficult or sustained. It all stayed pretty solid class three in my estimation. I actually thought there would be a fair bit more scrambling than there actually was based on reports that I'd read online. So just bear that in mind, I guess. So a little bit of up and down as you go across this ridge here, and a little bit of class two, really just in the section between this high point here and then this one over here. And then honestly, that's pretty much it for the scrambling. It relents back to class two boulder hopping after this. And then finally you come up, and then once you get to this point, about 200 feet below Navajo Peak, there's another class three section that basically drops you up right at the summit. And there's a couple of different ways you can choose to ascend to the summit. If you're looking at it kind of from this direction of heading towards it, there's one route that you can take kind of on the left of it that will direct you to the summit, and then another kind of chute that's quite narrow, that's maybe a little bit more direct on the right side, and that will get you to the summit of Navajo Peak. And this peak, the reason I like this peak is more than anything, I think, because of the way it looks. It's just this really aesthetic looking conical peak from a distance. I can actually see it from where I live. And if you are down here in this glacial valley here, you can see it quite well too. It's just this cool conical peak, very cool shape. And the scrambling here is fairly fun too. Um, so I also commend it to that. Now, I will also note on the descent on the way down, there is an alternate route, which I think is generally considered the standard route that I took. So I took a different way down here, which you can tell right here. This is called the Airplane Gully. And the reason for that is because there's actually an airplane wreckage within this gully that you pass by as you're descending through. And then this is all, I would say the gully is entirely class two. It's fairly steep class two. There's some loose crap in there that you got to be careful with, but still all class two. And then basically all the way class two across this whole section until you get back to the trail, which starts right around here-ish. And then once you're there, you pick up the trail and then you're sort of on your way out. Um, Navajo Peak, I really like this one. I had when I did this in July of 2024, excuse me, I had a beautiful, oh, just a perfect, beautiful sunny day, and it was actually quite hot. It was like I could have taken a nap and just enjoyed the sunshine on the summit at 13,400 feet. Um, but yeah, it was just a beautiful, very relaxing and peaceful day. And it was a fun climb too, because you kind of got to make this loop out of it. Whenever you can kind of make a loop or a lollipop kind of connection in my book, that increases the ranking and coolness of the climb because you get to see more and see different unique places. So I got to do a bit of scrambling on this ridge, and I got to pass by the airplane wreckage on the way down and see this little area. This is also a really cool little basin here, high elevation basin with really just massively tall, spectacular peaks surrounding it. So yeah, for all those reasons, I'm going to throw Navajo Peak in A tier. So there's another A tier peak for us. Um, and now the next peak we have is Apache Peak, neighbor of Navajo, just slightly taller. And I believe, no, so North Arapaho is actually the highest point in the Indian Peaks wilderness. Apache Peak is the second highest point. So, fun fact. But even though it is taller than Navajo Peak, so the one advantage I will give it is that it has a better view because you can see to the other side of this whole western part of the Indian Peaks wilderness. This basin is incredibly cool. I've camped up where I've done a backpacking trip where this little blue track is, you can see there. Incredible and actually a very famous area as backpacking goes. But it has views right into there. It has, because it's, really the highest point in its vicinity, it has views in every direction, very cool, north, south, and just jagged glacial scenery and incredible peaks, valleys, lakes, everything. So it's got the views game down very well, but I'm not going to commend it especially well after that point. I did this in October of 2023, mid-October. So this was actually after the first snowstorm. And so there was a fair bit of snow on this ascent actually. And this is, despite how steep it looks, and it is quite steep, this does remain, I would say a difficult class two ascent, but it is still fundamentally class two because it's a lot of uh, boulder hopping on a very steep slope up to the summit here. When I did do this in that October. There was definitely some snow to deal with. I could mostly avoid the snow, but there were some sections that I had to work through. But if you didn't have the snow, then it would certainly be easier, much easier to climb this peak. But the climbing itself is not really that inspiring, and the peak doesn't look that inspiring from when you're down in here. It just kind of looks like a big kind of uh, not very inspiring blob, I suppose. Let's see if I can if I can even pick it out here in my little figured out it is this one, and we're gonna put it in the C tier. So I think the views alone are probably and the overall scenery of the Brainard Lakes area is what's keeping it out of D tier. But everything else, it wasn't really a particularly enjoyable climb. It was just a big old class 2 slog up a really steep slope. Not particularly fun. And um, I did run out of daylight on the way when I was coming down somewhere here because it was October and the days are much shorter. So there's that factor to contend with. So yeah, obviously some of these rankings are also going to be based off of my personal experience, which is going to be affected of what time of the year I did each of these peaks. So again, keep that in mind. You'd certainly have a better time if you did this in July, say I would expect. But yeah, so that's Apache Peak. Let's see. So then we get to skip up a little bit here. And now we have the final two in the Brainerd Lakes area. So let's talk about Paiute Peak. Paiute? I think it's just Paiute Peak. Let's talk about that first. So this was my finisher of the little quest to do all of the 13ers in this particular region. Yeah, November 15th, 2024 is when I did it. Yeah, Paiute Peak. I think more than anything else, I was excited about this peak because it was my finisher. There's really not much more commending this peak beyond that, I would say. So I did this in mid-November, and by this point, the first big, there had been a couple snowstorms by this point that had come through the mountains, and there was a lot of snow. I was snowshoeing basically all the way from where the road ends. So they do not plow this road once the snow starts falling. They don't plow the road past this winter trailhead. So if you do come and do these peaks in winter, you're going to be walking this road. But thankfully, the area is still well trafficked enough that if you're on this road during winter, most of the time there will be some sort of boot pack. And I would absolutely bring micro spikes if you're in that situation. But I absolutely needed snowshoes once I got past the trailhead here, and I was breaking trail almost the entire way. It was a lot of work. So yeah, I mean the ascent is kind of deceptive because it was only 3,000 feet of ascent, which is typically not much, but snowshoeing and breaking trail makes it so much harder, as you could tell by the amount of time that it took me to do this. And again, since I did this in winter, I would say actually getting up to the Blue Lake is straightforward. In summer, there will be a trail that is exposed and not covered in snow. There is a trail going up to Blue Lake. Once you get past Blue Lake, I believe it kind of peters out. But when I did this, this was again entirely on snow, so I was snowshoeing up a steep slope. I couldn't have seen a trail anyways if it's there. So I don't know. I suspect the trail does get um, significantly fainter once you go past Blue Lake here and more difficult to follow. So obviously keep that in mind. Whenever it's more difficult to follow, it'll take longer. So you got to factor in the time for that when you're climbing these peaks. But you could see at least on Gaia GPS, there is some sort of trail marked on here. Now, it does happen to follow the same route that I took up when I did this. And if you look at the video, you'll be able to see this. There was basically a long snow gully that started around here where it's still flat and shoots all the way up to say, I don't know, 12.8, 12.9, something like that. And it was continuous snow basically the whole way, but it was also very steep. I would say it was probably a little above 30 degrees. So When you get above 30 degrees, you're looking at avalanche terrain if there's a significant amount of snow. Um, but doing it in snowshoes was quite a slog, I would say, um, as opposed to what it would be in summer, which is presumably kind of class two bouldery, scree conditions up this gully when it doesn't have snow in it. But it did have snow. And it was fairly chilly and windy at the summit, again, November. So I didn't spend much time up there. Didn't really get to enjoy it a ton. So that's part of it. And but I think one idea I did have in mind though is if you climb this thing with that snowshoe kind of filled in, I think you could have a really fun ski descent off of this thing because the snow was basically continuous from like 12.9 all the way through the chute, like almost 1,000 feet down. And then if it's really snowed in, you could keep following, you could keep skiing down, obviously, from there. So yeah, that's Paiute Peak, Paiute Peak. So yeah, just not my favorite thing in the world, man. So for that reason, it will be going in the D tier. So we have our first D tier here is Paiute Peak. Now in the summertime, a lot of people do a loop peak of Paiute and the next peak, which is Mount Audubon, which is just to its east. It's a little bit higher, because you can actually follow this ridge fairly easy. I believe this ridge goes entirely at class two, just bouldery stuff without really much of a trail. But Mount Audubon is the next 13er here. And this actually does have a trail going all the way to all the way to the summit. If you start from the trailhead here, you can see it's this track here. And so yeah, you can in the summertime when the snow's gone, I believe you can keep this entirely at class one, but the only time I've been up there is in February, as you can see. So this was another big snowshoe slog day. But it probably makes, I would say Mount Audubon is probably the best 13er out of any of the ones that I'm going to talk about that is suitable for a winter ascent because you can see here that the approach the whole way is on fairly shallow slopes. This little section here is a little steeper, but other than that, none of these slopes are really going to be avalanche prone, or when I was up there, they really didn't hold much snow. A lot of the snow gets wind blown once you get up to this high tundra section here anyways. So um, uh, yeah, I think again, I would the cool part about Mount Audubon in particular is you get this view towards really this spectacularly rugged terrain of the peaks over here and then down to the 13ers we talked about earlier. So certainly worth doing, but so again, for the view, it definitely gets points for the view, but overall climbing quality, I mean, it was just kind of a slog on snowshoes and alternating between snow drifts and then having to drag my snowshoes on tundra and rocks and get them all nice and scratched up, which is always fun. So again, I would say all of these peaks are going to be more fun in summer. That's my opinion. I'm much more of a summer kind of guy in terms of hiking. I don't really ski. So, but if you ski, I'm sure it's a totally different matter. And as long as the snow is filled in, you could also have a fun and relatively safe ski descent off of this peak, I would imagine. But not terrible, but not my favorite peak in the world. Definitely better than Paiute Peak, but yeah, for all of that, let's see here. It's right here. I'm going to throw it in the C tier. So that's Mount Audubon. All right. So now we are on the final 13er of the Indian Peaks Wilderness and also the first 13er of Rocky Mountain National Park, Ogalalla Peak. And it's on the border of the wilderness area and the park. So it actually is technically in both. Ogalalla Peak. What is there to say about this one? Oh man. I don't know that I would pick a least favorite, but if I did, this would be it. And the reason for this, there's several reasons for this. Um, Basically, just looking at all of the criteria that I've laid out, it is it scores low in all of them, I would say. So first of all, this approach, you can see the pink route here. This approach, this was like an over a 20-mile day, 5,000 feet of ascent. This is getting into the what's called the Wild Basin area, and all of these peaks in here are notorious for their very long approaches because you can see where the trailhead is. The trailhead is very far down, relatively speaking. It's below 8,600 feet. It's like at 8,400 feet, which is quite a bit lower than the earlier trailheads that we've seen so far. That said, it's easy to get to. It's like an easy dirt road. It's in the national park. Any two-wheel drive vehicle can get to that area. Um, so I did isolation in, or Ogalalla, excuse me. I did Ogalalla in July. So summer conditions, which was absolutely necessary because you're not going to be doing 20 plus miles in the winter. No way. Good luck with that. Uh, in winter, in entirely winter conditions anyways. And the other issue is even though the peak itself is kind of flat on the top, any approach to get up to it is very steep and difficult. I would say at a maximum, you're probably going to be looking at some class 3 moves here. Now, you can also approach it from the from a little more south, a little further south on this. You can see there's a trail right there. So I know people do that. The way that I did it was coming into the basin on its north side, northeast side, and going up to Coney Pass. So the trail, let's see. The trail kind of ends. This particular basin is very low. It sees very little traffic, especially for national park. It's basically nobody goes up there, as far as that's concerned. So there's a great trail going all the way to Pear Lake that I would say is in good shape. But once you start to go past Pear Lake, the trail slowly decreases in quality and followability, if you want a word that I just made up there. Um, Once you get past, I would say the Hutchinson Lakes here, I think there's a couple of these. Once you start getting into this area, it becomes bushwhacking through willows and stunted crumults, pine trees, and all of this stuff. And it was not fun. It was not at all fun to route find and just to found out that I actually went the wrong way and whatever. And if you'll see here, Gaia GPS does have a little unmaintained trail marker there, but you can a lot of times you can't necessarily count on something that's listed on a map may just be an idea and not actually a reality. And this was very much the case here. It was the route finding was kind of difficult even just on the approach to get up to this. I would say the view from Coney Lake though is quite nice. It's not the best in the world, but you can see, cool vertical cliffs. You can see Ogalalla right there. But certainly, if you can, I would say most of this is going to be class 2 just because the route finding is so hard. But especially once you get after Coney Lake and as you continue up to Coney Pass, this is all class 2, all boulder hopping. And it actually gets worse than boulder hopping. It gets into my least favorite terrain that I've ever experienced anywhere in the mountains, and that is scree on a steep slope. The absolute worst stuff in the world. So once it starts getting steep here, it is just a scree fest. So it's this loose, gravelly crap that just, you take 2 steps and you slide back 1 step. It's that kind of stuff. It's just arduous. It's fun. It's not fun at all. It's dangerous to climb. It's just a mess. Now, once you get to Coney Pass, the route finding here becomes kind of tricky because now you have to gain up on this little tundra plateau. And how you do that was not entirely clear to me because this peak sees very little visitation, and so beta on it is fairly scant as far as these 13ers go. There is a fairly solid looking rock ridge that you could follow. Maybe if you stay on the crest of the ridge here that you can see in those contours. maybe it would go, maybe it wouldn't. When I got up there, I wasn't confident that it would go safely, staying below class 5 territory. But I think you may be able to find a way if you pick around. But what I did is come around on the other side a little bit, and there's a gully that you can follow that is it's got some loose crap in it, but there's also some solid rock that you can hold on to. And you absolutely need to wait until July if you're going to go this way because that's a north facing gully that's going to hold snow for a very long time. That said, once you get up to this plateau, then it's just an easy tundra walk for the last, I don't know, 400 feet or so. Just a walk on up there, and there's the summit. And the summit views are not particularly inspiring. Well, all of these summits are inspiring, like I said, but compared to some other mountains that you could climb, Ogalalla is just not my favorite. The summit view was not super good. I didn't get to stay super long because a thunderstorm was incoming pretty fast. Um, One thing I will absolutely warn on the way down, I'm going to zoom in a lot here, but the little pink part on the right here, that is the way I took up. That is the correct way. So if you're coming from Coney Pass to the north side of this, go up the first reasonable looking gully you find that's not just like straight cliffs or whatever. Once you find that gully, go up this thing. I made the mistake on my way down here on the left side. This gully, I think, was the single most dangerous thing, maybe at least one of the most single dangerous things I've ever done in the mountains. Descending this thing, it was loose, scree crap. I don't know. There was a couple times when I just felt like I was within a hair's width of just tumbling down this thing to um, certain injury and a lot of hurt. So please avoid that at all costs. Do not do what I did. Do not ascend or descend this further gully over. Pick the first gully. It is much safer. So that is my words of advice. And with all of that said, I think you can probably guess where this peak is going, and it is going in the D tier. I have no desire to ever do this peak again. And you probably will not either unless you're like me and you want to complete this checklist. Otherwise, there are basically any other mountain is a better choice in this list. So with the worst of the worst out of the way, I guess we will move on to Copeland Mountain. Copeland Mountain starts at the same trailhead. All of these next couple of groups of peaks are starting at the Wild Basin trailhead that I showed you earlier. That's kind of what it looks like stats wise. I did this peak in early mid-April, and there is still a ton of snow. There's actually probably the maximum snowpack is probably sometime in earlier mid-April, I would say. And so this was a pretty serious snowshoe. At this point, down in the lower elevations below, I would say 9,000 feet, things were mostly melted out. But once you start really getting up here, you're looking at a pretty uh, a pretty serious ascent by any stretch. In summer when all the snow is gone, you take a dry trail up to almost up to Ouzel Lake here, and then you have to cut off and kind of bushwhack through the trees. And it's basically just a big class 2 bushwhacking. And then once you get to this point, it's a tundra bouldery. I think it's mostly bouldery kind of way up to the summit there. It's just there's nothing particularly difficult about route finding. It's just a big physical slog to get up this thing because it's just a straight up for what is this? Over 2,000 feet of just going straight and up. Now, I did this when it was entirely snow covered. So in that sense, there's a sense in which that makes it easier because you're not necessarily dealing with having to balance on potentially loose rocks and boulders and stuff. So that's something to be aware of. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do this, and secondarily because the avalanche danger on this is fairly minimal. There's only maybe
one or two portions where it very, very short, small portions that the slope exceeds 30 degrees. Now that is still very steep to do on snowshoes, and you need special snowshoes to do that. Maybe I'll talk about my gear and at some other later juncture, but yeah, you definitely want the kind of like ascent kind of style snowshoes to get up this thing if you're going to do it at the same time of year that I did. So, but getting up here, it was a cool sense of accomplishment because being able to get to a high peak like that with so much snow and just kind of slogging it out, there's a real satisfaction that you certainly get in that, um, and that sort of thing. Um, Now, Copeland itself, the climbing, I would say, I guess I kind of described it. Nothing particularly special, just a big off-trail slog, like many of these are going to turn out to be. Um, the views from the top, certainly a tad better than our friend Ogalalla over here, but I don't know, nothing particularly cool or stunning. Um, relative to the other peaks, of course, it is stunning, as I can't emphasize this enough. Every one of these peaks will have stunning views, but so not particularly points for that, and just kind of a big slog, I would say, is what I would say this mountain is. So for that reason, let's see if I can find it here. I'm going to put it in the D tier, so another big just slog up a big hill, basically. And you can kind of see there, maybe I'll zoom in and show you. That's kind of the snow slope there. It's probably still very small on your screen, but just snowshoes, just straight up the thing is kind of what I did. All right, next peak, Isolation Peak. So a little over a month later, I came back to the same area. This was towards the tail end of May, and did Isolation Peak. At the lower elevations by this point, the snow is pretty much melted out. But once you get up to stay, especially once you're above 10,000 feet, May is the time of year where it is just absolute mashed potatoes. There's still, the bulk of most of the snow is still there, but it's melting very fast. And even snowshoes are not necessarily going to save you because it is wet and everything is melting and you're just slopping around. And you can see that if you go check out my video I did on this. But yeah, that gives you an idea of kind of some of the stats there. This was also, this was a very long day. This was a 13-hour day. So um, just fairly ridiculous, honestly. Um, I chose to do these peaks this time of year because basically because they were feasible, at least in my skill set of like, oh yeah, the avalanche danger is not really an issue here. I know I have the endurance to get up this thing. And it's not like some sheer cliff or some difficult scrambling on steep stuff that you couldn't really do in snow. So that's why I did this peak at this time of year. Isolation Peak, I think what was cool to me about this peak is the general approach because it's so far back, it really feels like it lives up to the name. It is total isolation. I had this peak all to myself. I actually had most of the peaks that I've gone through so far, I've had to myself. Most of the peaks that are in this entire list, I had them to myself when I was on them. But Isolation Peak in particular, it's just really, really out there. It's way out there. You feel like you're totally away from all of civilization. And it's just a really enjoyable wilderness feeling that I never get tired of. So it gets points for that. It gets points for the views because now you're starting to move closer and closer to, I think, what is the most spectacular area of this entire part of the state that we're going to talk about soon as you move closer and closer to that. Um, but overall, still not my favorite peak. Still not one that I'm going to really repeat. The ascent, again, similar to Copeland, I would say, was just a big slog up in the snow. And just the length of time some of these things take, and this is partly my fault, is that I often underestimate that. Oh, this is actually going to take like 13 hours to do, where it could be, you know, 2 or 3 hours quicker in summer conditions. So that's part of the deal. But the trail, I believe, ends at, zoom in a little farther. The trail goes, there's a good trail that goes all the way to Bluebird Lake. And then at that point, you're kind of on your own into class two territory. There's some bushwhacking here at the lower sections. And then it turns into boulder hopping at the higher sections. And then, as far as I'm aware, this is all just a really steep, a fairly steep boulder field. Again, not really that fun to ascend. Just you just have to be just it's just tedious. It's just a bunch of tedious kind of crappy hiking, so to speak. Snowshoes again make it a little it makes it less tedious, but it makes it more physically difficult because you're having to, you know, slosh through wet, heavy snow at the same time. So yeah, that's Isolation Peak. Again, like I said, the one area that it does get points is indeed the isolation, and that's certainly a cool aspect of it. But other than that, another peak I'm not going to repeat, and for that reason, it is going in D tier. So the D tier is definitely filling up here, but that's going to change quickly. Don't worry. As we get into the next mountain, Mount Alice. All right, Mount Alice. This is a fun one. This is now things are going to really improve and look up here. So I did this in July of 2023. That's some of the stats to give you an idea of what things are like up there. Um, so the cool thing about this is you can do this as a lollipop kind of loop here because there are two different branching trails that you can see follow. This is Thunder Lake here to the south, and these are the Lion Lakes up here in the north. And there's a trail going all the way up here. Once you get past the last of these lakes, I would say the trail kind of fades out. And then you're left to kind of a class two ascent up this ridge. This ridge is all class two. In fact, this entire peak, I would say, is class two. Um, I actually read in a couple of sources that it was a class three scramble, which made me look forward to it a little bit more, but I was a little bit disappointed in that department, really. It was really more of a, um, this section here is what they were talking about, but this was much more of a class two plus steep boulder field kind of slog type thing. There are certainly instances where you could probably make it harder and do a couple of class three moves, but you'd really have to go out of your way to do it. So if you're looking for top-notch scrambling, this is really not your peak, I would say. But the summit views were awesome because any summit views that's getting closer to this area right here, very, very cool. The spectacular glacial ridges of these peaks that we're going to talk about soon. And Mount Alice itself it's a very cool looking peak. It's got this very cool, just sheer east face. You can see it on the contour map right here, and kind of in the image right here. That's kind of what it's this pointy, sheer east face, and the way you ascend it is up this kind of ramp you can see on the right side. Looker's right there, and then the way that I descended it was coming down the other side, which is much less steep and drops you down to all the way down to Boulder Grand Pass. This is entirely a class two easy grassy tundra walk. Then you kind of get into some steep scree-ish territory here to get down to Lake of Many Winds, which is an awesome lake name. Sounds like a lake out of Skyrim or something. Lake of Many Winds. So cool little lake there. This descent is probably the most annoying part to get down to the lake because it's kind of it's kind of loose class three crap, and because a lot of people go up this, it sees a lot of erosion. But once you get to that point, I would say there's kind of a faint trail that starts to tail off. It comes in fits and spurts on the way back, but especially once you get past it, back to Thunder Lake, then the trail comes back in full force, and it's totally class one, just normal hiking after that. One other thing I never mentioned with these is I did all of these as day hikes. And the reasons for that is twofold. I mean, number one, I'm, in physically good enough shape to do it. And number two, getting permits to camp in any of these places is either, in some places it's banned entirely, or some places it's very difficult because this is all in Rocky Mountain National Park, and backcountry campsites in national parks are always in high demand. Now, Wild Basin certainly less so than other areas of the park because it is so isolated, because it's kind of away from the main attractions that Rocky Mountain is so famous for. So it would certainly be easier to get these particular campsites if you wanted to backpack in the first day and then get the summit and kind of break it up a bit and not have to do 20 miles and 5,000 feet in a single day or something. So that's certainly something you can do. And of course, you spend a night in the beautiful backcountry of Colorado. So not many things much better than that. Yeah, so that's Mount Alice. And next up, we're going to look at Chief's Head Peak. So this is either the I think this is the second 13er. We'll get to the first later, I guess. Uh, or maybe it is the first, actually. I think it is the first 13er I ever did, which is quite something because you can see how much of a slog it is. I really underestimated, I think, how much work this was to do. Again, starting at the Wild Basin Trailhead, which is fairly low. So you have a lot of ascent to do to get up to this thing. Um, and I would say, yeah, there's a good trail going all the way up to Sand Beach Lake here. And there's, in fact, campsites there if you want to grab a backcountry site. Once you get past that, though, this is all class two. There's bushwhacking in the trees here, and then as the trees opened up, it gets into more tundra and then boulder hopping. But eventually you get on this, what is called the North Ridge, which is very strange because it is in fact the South Ridge of Chief's Head geographically, but it's called the North Ridge. Who knows? But this is all tundra until once you can see where the contours start to steepen here. This starts getting more and more bouldery, and the boulder field just increases and gets steeper as you head towards the summit. And then at some point, it's entirely class two plus um, boulder fields and boulder hopping. Now, this is, again, there's multiple ways you could do this mountain. This is just the way I chose to do it. I think because this was still in June. So the other side, which is north facing, is fairly snowed in. But I think if you were to go later in the year, I would actually recommend coming in from the Glacier Gorge side. This place is absolutely spectacular. And I'm going to talk more about that because it will come up in two other 13ers that we're going to look at here. Which I believe if you were to come up from, this is Stone Man Pass here, and follow this, I believe you get some class 3, maybe even class 4 stuff right here on this ridge here. But I have not done that, so don't take my word on that. All I can say is that the route that I took is class 2. The peak is certainly less inspiring looking from this angle because you can kind of tell from the contours, it's a lot more flat. And in fact, here it is right here. So this is Chief's Head. So you can tell the kind of tundra slope you walk up. That's the summit right there, and it gets more bouldery as you go. This is early in the year, so there was still a fair bit of snow up there. But the much cooler, more inspiring angle on this peak is from the other side. And you can really see that on the contours because you can see how this peak just drops straight down. It's just a sheer vertical face on its north side. And it's it's one of the most beautiful mountains from that side if you can get up to this Glacier Gorge area. But not so much from the other side. So since I think if you were to ascend from the north through Glacier Gorge, I think it would probably be an A tier for me. But because it wasn't, because the way that I did take up was kind of a slog and not super inspiring, I'm going to be putting it in B tier. Here it is. So Chief's Head goes in B tier, and the views from the summit are top notch. So that is part of what pushes it up into B tier, even with the subpar approach, because you look straight down into Glacier Gorge. You can basically on the summit. You know, you can hang your feet over like a 1,500-foot drop if you want to, if you're feeling a little daring, and look straight down. And then you also look straight over to the tall peaks over here, which we're going to talk about next. And just, yeah, this is a cool peak. I like it a lot. With a better approach from Glacier Gorge, I'm sure it'd be A tier, but because of the approach that I did do, it's going in B tier. Next, we have Pagoda Mountain. All right. So I did this peak in, let's see, July. Yeah, July of 2024. There it is. And I actually combined it with the next peak I'm going to talk about, Lawns Peak. And I came up from the Glacier Gorge trailhead. Now, this is the busiest part of Rocky Mountain National Park. So this is going to apply to a couple of these other mountains in here. But Glacier Gorge, there's a permit or what would you say? There's a timed entry permit that's required to even drive up to this area. But the window for that, at least as of when I'm doing this video, has been from 5 a.m. to 6 p.m. And you're normally going to want to get an earlier start than that anyways to avoid the monsoon thunderstorms in summer. So it's actually not that bad if you're willing to just wake up super, super early to get up there. As long as you get through the whatever, this Bear Lake Road station, which is somewhere around here. As long as you get past that gate before 5 a.m., you're home free. No permit required to actually park there. It's just a permit to enter the park. So once you're through, you're basically good. Of course, this lot is oftentimes almost full, anyways, by the time you get to 5 a.m. So even if you do get a permit, you might not have a place to park. But there are shuttle buses that go up, but I don't think they go up as early as 5 a.m., which is really what you need. You need that amount of time to get this peak and these other peaks because they're high and you need to be off the ridge before the thunderstorms roll in summer. But all that logistical stuff said, Glacier Gorge. What can I say about Glacier Gorge? There are a couple other places that in the park that really put up a good fight, but I think I have to say that Glacier Gorge is my favorite place in the entire park, in all of Rocky Mountain National Park. It just the scenery, the mountain scenery is just perfect in such an unbelievable way. There are jagged ridges, there's high alpine lakes and the reflection of the mountains in the lakes, and there's the big snowfields, huge granite alpine walls, giant spires, just a sweeping view in every direction. I cannot speak more highly about Glacier Gorge. Even if you don't climb a single 13er, go and hike up to Glacier Gorge and see it for yourself. Highly, highly recommend. Oh, I will never stop singing its praises. So that is obviously going to push Pagoda Mountain fairly high up in the list and even higher because the climbing to get up to there is actually surprisingly fun. The contours on the topo map don't necessarily indicate this, but as you're kind of coming up here, so there's a class 1 trail all the way up to this is Black Lake here. And it's still pretty much a trail up to this drainage here, but it starts to fizzle out. And then at some point you're going to be in kind of class 2 bushwhacking through willows, in some point alternating with walking over bare rock. And that's you'll probably be able to find some social trails going up in here. The Spearhead here is a famous rock climbing route, so people go up there. But it's going to be a little bit iffy on the trail side of things to get to Green Lake. And once you're at Green Lake, then you're going to make the turn east. This initial section is definitely class 2 boulder hopping. But once you start really ascending this slope, you actually have a lot of options here. But the most fun option and the option that you should do is sticking on the class 3 very solid slabs. And it was actually a fair bit of fun to scramble on these slabs, which is not normally something you get on like a big
on a big slope gully type thing like that. But it was a pleasant surprise, and I actually had a lot of fun climbing up to this saddle right here because of the nice slabs that made it more fun. You could stick to, close by. There's class two boulders if you for some reason wanted to go on that, but you don't want to do that. You want to stick on the fun class three climbing to get to the saddle there. Once you do get to that saddle, however, you are going to be going back to class two to get to the summit of this peak. This green track here is what I recorded, but it's definitely a bit off. You do not go up this way. You come up to the saddle here and stay on this ridge crest here indicated by the contours to get to that summit. And that's all. That's mostly class two with a couple of class three moves thrown in. Oh man, Pagoda Peak, dude, or Pagoda Mountain. The climbing, the approach is perfect because it's through Glacier Gorge. The actual climbing is for the most part, it's a lot of fun because there was a lot of fun slab, solid class three stuff involved. And boy, the views, uh, I don't know. I've said a lot about views so far, and I will say more, but man, Pagoda has got to have one of the top three vantage points in the entire park. And the reason I say this is because number one, you have all of Glacier Gorge spread out below you. You have this huge face of Chief's Head that's just it's right there in front of you. And then, of course, the monarch of the entire northern Front Range in Colorado, Lawns Peak, the huge bulking mass of Lawns Peak. Immediately to your east, just a massive, intimidating, awe-inspiring mountain. And you get all that, and plus you get to have a nice look into Wild Basin to the south with its own peaks. Pagoda is just top-notch up there, just chef's kiss every part of the way. Um, so it is absolutely going in A tier. There is no question about it. Pagoda is definitely one of my favorites. And after doing Pagoda on the same day, I traversed over to Lawns Peak. There's not much I could say about Lawns Peak that hasn't been said already. It's one of the famous 14ers. It is the only 14er on this entire list that I'm going to be talking about. And it is probably one of the most studied and most climbed mountains of any conceivable route. Any place that you look at this contour map, somebody's found a way to go up it. Like seriously, because it is such a famous and well-known peak. So I don't know that I can say much about it. I did do a nice little link up here from Pagoda to Lawns that was a little more unique. There's a couple of particularly difficult routes in the park that involve doing this traverse, but the main ascent up Lawns Peak is the keyhole route. This is a trail pretty much up to the boulder field here, which you can see marked, and then the keyhole. This gets more class 2-y, and then once you get to this point, it's pretty much solid class 3 all the way up to the summit. Now, it's a long hike, it's a long ways, but this is the most popular high mountain summit in the entire park. And so there are big bullseyes marking you the entire way. Honestly, if you're watching this video, you probably are aware of Lawns Peak and know all of this stuff. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but um, Lawns Peak absolutely goes in A tier. There's no question about it. Just the mountain itself and every single angle. I've been up there twice, which is much fewer times than many people have been. But so I've done both the keyhole and then I also did this traverse from Pagoda. So that's my two ascents of Lawns. And this view on it, which is probably one of the more unique views of it, is kind of on the back side, looking to the east from Pagoda Mountain, which kind of shows you can kind of see the last portion of the keyhole route that kind of ascends just below the cliffs here and then falls all the way up to the home stretch. But it's very solid class 3 climbing and it's Lawns Peak. So you're probably never going to have the mountain to yourself in summer, certainly. I did have the summit to myself for about 10 minutes on this particular day, I think, which is quite something. I mean, this was like 3:30 in the afternoon, so most people were smart and had gone down. But I didn't encounter any thunderstorms that day, so it worked. But yeah, so
you're not going to have this mountain by yourself. You're not going to have solitude, but it is an absolute blast. It's fun. It's a classic climb. And yeah, there's nothing I can say that already hasn't been said. So on to the next mountain, Mount Meeker, which is Lawns Peak. It's the neighbor of Lawns Peak. It's very high. It's 13.9. The elevation is not necessarily correct here. Um, so it just misses out on being a 14er. And the route I took, again, there's a couple of different routes on Meeker. You can actually come up from Wild Basin if you wanted to, and do a fair bit of off-trail bushwhacking to get up to the tundra and ascend the ridge. It's Southeast Ridge. I, though, started from the Lawns Peak trailhead, which, by the way, is obviously the same trailhead from which you climb Lawns Peak itself, um, which is, it's paved road, easy to get to, no problems there. This trail is very, it's perfectly maintained. It's about as good shape trail as you can get. Basically, almost all the way until Chasm Lake here, which is one of my favorite lakes in the park, probably my favorite lake in the park, I would say. But at that point, once you get to Chasm Lake, then the class one trail ends and you're going to be doing a bunch of class two boulder hopping up through. You can see here this little divot in the contours. This little divot is called the Iron Gates. And if you do this, you'll see why it's called that. Very much a rocky opening between two pillars, two rocky spires on Meeker's very cool north face here. And then once you get up to that saddle there, it's not fun. It's the actual set to get to the saddle is not fun. It's just class two. There's a lot of loose rock. It's kind of annoying. So it gets docked a couple of points for that. But once you get up to the saddle around 13,000 feet, it's boulder hopping class two on fairly solid rock up to this point at the first 13.8 contour line. And at this point, there's a bit of a knife edge ridge actually that you have to traverse, and I would call this class three. It's definitely solid class three to get to the true summit of Meeker, 13,911 feet, I think it is. Um, Mount Meeker, yeah, it's not the best of the best, I would say, but it's still a ton of fun, and you get a really cool view of Lawns Peak because you're so close to it. This whole glacial valley here with Chasm Lake is just unbelievable. If there's snow in it, it looks like something straight out of Patagonia. It's just otherworldly. So that part of it is really cool. Meeker itself is cool because it's the second highest peak in the park, and so it still does really have a cool high vantage point, and it really feels like you're up there. Um, Odds are, I think it's definitely one of the more popular 13ers in the park. It is nowhere near as popular as Lawns Peak, of course, but more likely than not, you will see at least a couple of different parties probably ascending this on a nice summer day. Now, so I talked about the Iron Gates route, which is what I indicated there. Another route you can do is called the Loft route, which you can see in this kind of, I guess this is kind of a dark blue or purplish color here. This route here, which I have not done. This is just something I've put on the map when I'm playing around. But this is supposedly this stays at class three, and there's some scrambling that you have to do here. There's a very large snowfield right here that I would say you might have to wait even until August until that snowfield is really clear enough to get past it without having to deal with it. Especially if it's like a heavy snow year or something. That snowfield is almost there's a part of it that stays permanent year round. And then from that point, once you get through the really steep contour lines here, this is the class three section. A lot of different ledges, a lot of bit of traversing back and forth. I would definitely look up a route description for this because it's easy to get confused. But then you get to the loft, and then it's just some class two boulder hopping to get to the summit of Meeker from there. So that is Mount Meeker. Let's see. I think I'm going to put Mount Meeker in A tier because of the approach I did to the Iron Gates. It doesn't quite it doesn't, it's not quite in the same league, I would say, as say Lawns Peak necessarily, but it's totally up there. I did the little knife edge you get to do here is a lot of fun. It's a really fun scramble. And it's pretty exhilarating if you like the heights and the exposure and a little bit of danger tingly sense, whatever. And the views are just amazing. And I feel like I'm saying that about every one of these recent peaks, but it's totally true. This whole area, this is the, pardon the pun, this is the peak level of the park right here. I would say, in my opinion, this little ridge here that connects to the Continental Divide. So that's Mount Meeker, solid A tier pick, low A tier, I would say. Okay, moving on to McHenrys Peak. So I talked about the Glacier Gorge approach already with Pagoda. So for that reason, McHenrys is already going to get quite a few points out of that. And additionally, it has quite a fun scramble to go with it. So similar to Pagoda, it's a class one. But once you get to here, you're going to branch off to the west a bit. And this is, again, you might be able to find some social trail. This area is fairly well cairned, I would say. If you look for it, there's cairns going all the way up to the summit of this mount of this 13er, as there are with many of these peaks, in fact. So you can definitely think, keep an eye out for cairns, but of course have your own route finding ability good enough so that you could do it without cairns if you needed to. So this is all class two. Now, to get to Stone Man Pass, there's two different ways you could do it. When I did this was so this was August, so that's kind of an idea of what this looked like. Um, there is a snowfield that sticks around on this left side here for a very long time. Like the snowfield was still mostly there in August. Um, Now I think you can mostly avoid it, but let me talk about the way I went up first. So the way I went up is actually on the right side here. This is actually the way that I would recommend, going up and down. This is a lot of class three climbing on really solid slabs, really solid rock, a lot of fun. And then, you get to this little bump in the ridge here, and then you follow that over back to the pass itself, the Stone Man Pass, which is named for a particular formation that's right around here on this ridge. And then, yeah, so you get to the pass. And then at this point, I would say this is definitely one of the more difficult individual peak scrambles you're going to get in the park. This stuff is mostly class two when it's not quite as steep here on class two boulders and stuff. But once you get into the steep final pitch section here, this is going to be, I would say it's even class three plus. I don't know if it would quite reach into the class four territory. I don't think it quite gets there, but I would say it's more difficult class three. You definitely have to be careful with your exact route finding and your foot placement. And there was one or two points coming down, which I found kind of sketchy and had to take, a little bit of a very, very small jumps or drops of faith coming down. But overall, though, really, really not too bad. If you have the scrambling skills, if you don't have the scrambling skills, do not go to this peak, do another one. But if you do have the scrambling skills to handle something like that, it's a blast and it's a lot of fun. And this peak is very aesthetic looking. Again, similar to Chief's Head, it just drops off at all of these angles. And the cool part about the approach is once you get to Black Lake, you can just see this thing looming over you, and it's just this sheer face, and you can look up and see the point and the high point of the peak, and you're like, wow, am I really going to go up that thing? Um, so absolutely really cool part about that. And again, 360-degree views from this peak are unsurpassed, top notch. You can see up down into Glacier Gorge all the way to Lawns. This whole string, this whole ridge line right here is so pretty. And then even down to the other side here, this is a very steep drop here down to this notch. And then, yeah, just every direction all around. Like all of the other peaks in the Glacier Gorge area, this is hands down, one of my favorites. And it is absolutely going in the S tier, no question. Let's see if I can find it. Here it is. Okay. A tier, I should say. A tier, I should say. Oh, and look at me. Okay, so I forgot to place Mount Alice. Uh, Mount Alice goes in the B tier. I can't believe I forgot to do that. So there's Mount Alice that I talked about earlier. If I didn't mention it goes in the B tier. Yeah, very cool looking peak. Very, but the approach, little class two, not quite as good as these Glacier Gorge peaks that we've been talking about. Yeah, that's slight diversion. That's McHenrys Peak. And then the next one is going to be Powell Peak. So this one I did in conjunction with another 13er. This was in, what was this? Yes, this was October of 2023. This day was beautiful. It was one of the most beautiful days I've ever spent in the mountains. It was just a sunny October day. There had been, the first kind of brief snowstorm had swept through, but this was entirely sunny. It was beautiful. It was warm. It felt like summer again. It was just wonderful. So um, the way that you do Powell Peak here is starting at let's see, I guess I started at the Bear Lake trailhead in this case, but Bear Lake or Glacier Gorge, again, see those permanent restrictions. Be ready for those. Get up really early to get up here so you can avoid that. And yeah, I'll talk about Taylor and Powell Peak together. So Powell Peak is the one right next to McHenry's here, and then Taylor Peak is the one further to the west. This was entirely, let's see, so there was a trail coming up to this point, and then kind of a social trail that branched off to the west here, Andrews Glacier Trail. It's kind of got fits and spurts, but it's not a terrible trail up until you get to Andrews Tarn. And then at this point, you are at the base of Andrews Glacier. Now, as far as glaciers go, Andrews Glacier is very tame. I think it's like a 20-ish degree slope. I just walked up this thing with my micro spikes on and nothing else. I didn't bring an ice axe, though an ice axe would be helpful. You should probably bring an ice axe for this, honestly. Don't do what I did and not bring it. Um, but this is fairly tame as far as glaciers go. No crevasses when I did it in October. That might vary by year to year and depending on the snowfall totals and stuff. So just be aware of that. It's not like it's a guaranteed straight shot up the thing. But yeah, you can pretty much walk up this thing to this Andrews Pass here, which drops you off directly onto some, I would say, rocky tundra territory here. But again, it's all class two, and it's basically just a big 1,000-foot ramp up to get to Taylor Peak here. And the highlight of this particular day and these two peaks, Taylor and Powell Peak, was the view of the Sky Pond Cirque here, this huge glacial valley. Oh man, if Glacier Gorge was number one, the Sky Pond area is absolutely in the top three for areas of the park. Just incredible glacial cliffs, glacial scenery. You can see how far things drop here. It's worth going to Sky Pond just to see it. Just to see it from below because it's just again otherworldly, incredible mountain scenery, some of the best in Colorado, no question. And you also have views of a lot of very cool rock spires over here that are quite famous as technical rock climbs in the park here that you get a perfect view of there. And you kind of get to, by climbing these 213ers, you get to semi circumnavigate this Sky Pond Cirque here all the way around. So you get to basically have a nice tundra walk, but you have like just a 2,000-foot drop down in some places immediately to your left as you're walking eastwards to get over to Powell. But again, the actual hiking itself, this is all class two across grassy tundra with certainly some rocks and some boulders in it. And then Powell Peak, again, this is another peak where you could like sit on the edge of it here and then just have your feet dangling like 1,000 feet down over this northeast aspect here, just a sheer cliff. And then the view of McHenrys is exceptionally cool because you see it this edge on here and it's this really sharp edge.
So also totally cool. This is, I would say, let's see here. Yeah, so this is closer to 4,400 feet. Now you could honestly, you could just do Taylor and still have a fantastic, awesome day. So in terms of difficulty, um, yeah, this is maybe starting to get into the realm of more reasonable. You still have to be comfortable with off-trail travel. All of these peaks, there's not a single one of these peaks that has a designated, maintained trail going to the summit of them. Just to reiterate that, all of these peaks require significant amounts of off-trail travel, and these two are no exception. But if you are comfortable with that, by all means, this is certainly a nice one that is not too ridiculously hard or challenging. So let's see. I think we're going to put Powell Peak. We're going to put both of these in B tier. Let's see. So this is this cliff here. This is Taylor Peak. So Taylor Peak right there is going to go in B tier, and then uh, let's see. Okay, here's Powell Peak. So it's kind of hard to see here. I took all of these pictures, these from screenshots from all of the videos that I took. So varying quality, I would say, but Powell Peak is this little ramp right here. And so it is also going to go into B tier. Um, the one thing I would say against it is that, again, the actual approach and climbing of this is class two, and it's not particularly inspiring or fun. It's just kind of a slog up tundra. So, but other than that, fairly top-notch peaks. And before we go further north, there is one peak I forgot back over in the Lawns Peak group, and that is Mount Lady Washington right here. So it's really more of a sub peak of Lawns Peak, I would say, but certainly worth a visit in its own right. I did this peak in early March of 2024, in which there was still a ton of snow. And it happened to be quite a cold day, but there was it literally snowed just the previous day, and it was just fresh and totally coated on the trees and just felt like a complete picture perfect winter wonderland. So I have good memories of that particular day. But the ascent itself is not really that fun. So you come up the same trail that you would to go up to Mount Meeker that we talked about earlier, but then you branch off instead and kind of follow this ridge. This is a very steep class two boulder hopping. This is really not any fun at all. I can't recommend this ascent in any sense. It's just difficult class two boulder hopping. So I came up this way, and when I did it in March, it was like mixed snowshoes, boulder hopping. You can kind of see it here if we look at these. So here's Mount Lady Washington, and you can kind of see the mix of snow and boulders as you go higher up. And so it's extremely annoying to deal with and climb when the snow is in full force. And so I didn't want to go down that way. So after I summited, I decided to follow a more gentle but still a lot of class two boulder hopping down to finally get into some snow, some fairly nice snow descent here, in which my snowshoes proved much more comfortable to descend and then come back. So because this was March, this is winter. Um, Lawns Peak in winter, for example, is way, that's above my skill level. So I was totally happy to just get this peak, and I haven't spoken super highly of it so far, but its redeeming value is the view. The view is otherworldly, really otherworldly, and it's specifically because of this vantage point it has to Lawns Peak and also Mount Meeker. You can see this is the diamond here, this huge northeast face of Lawns Peak. This is just a straight vertical cliff, one of the famous classic alpine rock climbs in all of the United States is on that face. And seeing it in winter in an immediately fresh snow where the snow is just perfectly set and covered on everything in winter wonderland style, looking down to the frozen expanse of Chasm Lake
and then over to Mount Meeker and how the snow fills all the gullies there. It is, again, it's Patagonia style terrain. So the absolute best, hands down, best part of Mount Lady Washington is the view from the summit towards Lawns Peak, especially, but also Mount Meeker, just to see all this sheer terrain. Um, I don't know, maybe the most otherworldly sheer cirque in all of Colorado is this Chasm Lake cirque here. And so I honestly, I just, when I got to the summit and saw the view, I just let out an audible gasp because I was like, whoa, it just incredible. So worth it to do just for that. So yeah, it definitely gets marks. I would say it definitely gets marks for that, but that keeps it out of D tier, I would say, and it gets it into C tier is for just the view alone. But everything else about this peak is not really fun to deal with and fairly even forgettable, I would say. So, but if you look at this actual mileage and stuff, it was a lot harder in winter when I did it, but this can be a less than 10-mile trip, less than 4,000 feet of ascent. So if you're just looking for a quick high summit and a fantastic view, I would still recommend this peak. Absolutely. Certainly better and easier in the summer. If you're fast, again, you could probably make a half day out of this particular mountain if you just did it, just did Mount Lady Washington. So yeah, that's what I would say about that. And now, without zooming out too much, um, we will depart from the most rugged area of Rocky Mountain National Park, and we're actually going to go north quite a ways up to the final 5 13ers that we're going to talk about. Up to what is called the Mummy Range here. So you can kind of see, let me zoom out and give you some perspective. This area down here, with all the colorful routes there, that's the Lawns Peak area. You can see the town of Estes Park is right there to the east. And the Mummy Range is right here in the north central region of the park. And there are 5 13ers in this range. The first one is Mount Chiquita. So I said all of these peaks were hard to climb, like really difficult hikes. And it's true, all of them are. Mount Chiquita is probably the one exception to that rule. I would say it was even a moderate hike. And the reason for that is because it has, I think it's definitely the highest trailhead of any of these peaks because you can ride up the dirt, two-wheel drive dirt, Old Fall River Road, all the way up to the Chapin Pass trailhead, which is at 11,000 feet. This only has parking for a couple of spots. So just, keep that in mind. Get up there early or don't try to get up there on a Saturday or something. But once you're at this point, the trail is, I would say, fairly well maintained. It kind of starts to peter up once you get into this higher tundra area and especially past this saddle here. It starts to kind of peter out and become more difficult to follow, but fundamentally it's not hard. And starting from this trailhead, it's only 2,000 feet to the summit of Mount Chiquita, which is right here with the little house marker there. The summit itself, the approach itself is not super inspiring because the backside of these peaks is just these kind of grassy, bouldery, rocky slopes on the west side that you'll be seeing when you approach it. So the approach itself is not, I don't know, very aesthetically pleasing. So, but the hike itself, by far the easiest 13er in this entire list. So if you're a beginner hiker, this is the one that you want to do. If you're like really itching to get a high summit or a 13,000 foot summit, this is the one you want to do is Mount Chiquita. Other than that, there's not really not that much to say about it. It's not a super unique standout peak, I would say, only because it has much taller neighbors, which we will move on to once we place Mount Chiquita in its place. And really because because the climbing isn't particularly standout. I mean, it's just class 1, class 2, and the summit is kind of flat, and because it has nearby taller, very close, taller neighbors that are going to be more interesting anyways, We're just going to throw it in D tier. Um, Certainly not a totally forgettable peak, but kind of forgettable, but certainly worth mentioning because it is absolutely the easiest one on the list. So if you're a beginner hiker, this is one you can definitely go for. Now, let's move on to the star of the entire Mummy Range, without a doubt, which is Ypsilon Mountain. Now, Ypsilon Mountain, the way I strung Chiquita and Ypsilon together in one day is starting from this area. I actually started from the Alpine Visitor Center. This was back in June before this road was open, so I couldn't drive up to this pass. So I had to walk down this road a little bit, but I strung both of these together. And Ypsilon is obviously much better than Chiquita. It's like 500 feet higher. I think it's actually 13.5, not 13.4, as is listed there. Um, but the cool part about Ypsilon Mountain is look at this terrain right here. You can see it on the contour maps. There are a couple of different classic scrambles and routes. This particularly rugged ridge you see right here, this is Blitzen Ridge. That's a classic alpine rock climb in the park that's very, very well regarded. And this Ypsilon Mountain has this awesome glacial cirque coming off of its southwest or southeast side here that is 100% worth seeing. If you would do this on a separate hike going up to the Spectacle Lakes here, but when I did it, I came up from the other side, and this was, there's kind of bits and pieces of a trail as you head up this thing from the southwest. But there's going to be inevitable class two, particularly as you get higher and higher. There's less grass and more boulder hopping, I would say. So definitely a little bit of off-trail navigation, but overall, really not that difficult. Uh, if you're gonna do Chiquita and you're, physically up to it and you have the time and the weather windows, definitely go and hit up Ypsilon too. It's a fun peak and it will also get you a much better view to the north here, um, towards the last couple of peaks that we're going to talk about. So, yeah, let's see. Ypsilon. I would say with all that, again, because I judge from when I experienced this peak, the actual hike itself was not that inspiring. It's like I said, fairly straightforward class one, class two. So there's not really much to commend for that part. And Ypsilon doesn't have like a particularly unique view from the summit. Like the view from the summit is cool, but there's a couple other peaks that we're going to talk about that have similar views. So it's not like it's a particular standout in that front. I think the coolest thing about Ypsilon is actually the the east side of it. The east face is very cool, very aesthetic, like I talked about. So, again, not my favorite hike in the world to do it from this side, but if I were to do it again, I might actually come out from the east side and check out one of these ridges. Um, I haven't looked into these other ridges in particular detail. This Blitzen Ridge here, this really rugged ridge, that's a class 5 technical rock climb. So that's not a scramble. You need ropes for that. But these other ridges might have some cool scrambling potential that certainly might, have me coming back. And in that case, I would certainly increase the ranking. But just for all of those reasons, we're going to put Ypsilon in the C tier. So not the bottom of the barrel, but also not my most favorite in the world, I would say. So um, now we're getting into the final three peaks here. So first up, we have Fairchild Mountain. I did this peak on its own back in, let's see when it was. This was in November of 2023, mid-November. So there was some snow at this point, but there wasn't really that much snow yet. It was fairly dry, I would say. Nonetheless, I did do this peak, and you can see it's quite a slog, and it's like 20 miles, 5,000 feet. But fairly easy in terms of like, not really any avalanche danger. Not that avalanches would have run at that time, but um, this is the first 13er that starts from the Long Lake trailhead. So this trailhead is also fairly low. it's below 8,600 feet. So any approach up to the peaks in this northern section here is going to be very long. Hence why this was like a 20-mile day and quite a bit of elevation gain. There's a great trail going um, all the way up past Long Lake, all the way up to this branch off with Crystal Lake. Um, and it starts to kind of taper off as you get up to the saddle here. This is actually what it's called. It's just the saddle. um, and then after that point, you're definitely on a sort of grassy, tundra-y, bouldery, boulder hopping kind of class two adventure up to Fairchild. There's not, again, like a lot of these similar kind of approaches, there's not really much to commend about the climbing here. It's just a lot of class two boulder hopping. The summit itself is fairly kind of flat and rounded and not super unique in that regard. But the views were really cool. And because I did this when there was snow on the ground, the snow always makes the peaks look prettier. And so it probably gets a couple of more points in that respect. This was my last summit to do that I had to do in the Maumee Range. I actually turned back on my first attempt because this snowstorm rolled in, but I got it on my second, and yeah, so not much to say about that one. I think that's pretty much everything. So let's see. I'm going to put it in. Let's see. Let's put it in C tier. So that is, I think, the final C tier peak, I believe. Again, nothing standout, not the worst, but really not the best either. And now we're on to the final two peaks. So Maumee Mountain. Again, this also starts from the Long Lake Trailhead. This is another kind of, once you branch off, you get to this junction in the trail here, and it's all trail, all class one up to this point. Then at some point, you're going to branch off here, and then once you start to ascend the kind of southeast slope of Maumee here, it just becomes a big grassy tundra slog to get up this thing. I believe I did this in late June of 2023. Let's see if I can actually even find the track here. Yeah, here we go. So that's the track here. This is Maumee Mountain, and then the next peak, I linked those two together. So that's kind of what that looks like. That was a really, really long day. That was a 14-hour day. I forgot it actually took that long. So July 1st, actually. So there was definitely some snow up there, but this was peak wildflower season. They were just fantastically blooming. Oh man, one of the coolest wildflower displays I've ever seen in the mountains. So that was worthwhile seeing. But again, this is just a big tundra slog, and the approach and the elevation gain really make it into quite a workout. So if I were to be more consistent, I would probably throw Maumee Mountain in C tier, but I think because of just the this is one of my first couple of 13ers that I got to do fairly early in the 2023 season. And just for the incredible wildflowers, and it just felt like peak top-notch summer in the mountains in every sort of way. And there's something about the mummies that has a little bit of a place in my heart because they're a lot less visited than other places of the park, and but they have their own charm to them. They don't have quite the pure spectacle that areas like Glacier Gorge do that I talked about earlier, but they're still a really special place of the park, and the lawn approach to them definitely keeps a lot of people away, which is helpful for crazy people like me who do perhaps more than they should in a day. But yeah, so I think for those reasons, I'm actually going to be putting Mummy in B tier. And there it is. And now we are moving over to the final peak of this little tour of 13ers, Hagues Peak. So, like I said, I did this on the same day as Mummy. I traversed right on over. When you come off of Mummy, it's kind of similar class two stuff. Once you start ascending again on the ridge towards Hagues, this immediately becomes, um, I don't know, fairly serious class two bouldery stuff. Not really any grassy, easy patches, just all a matter of keeping your balance and staying, making the right choices with where you're placing your feet, foot placement and stuff. And I would even say there's maybe a couple of even class three moves that you have to make kind of towards the end here. You might have to go out of your way to do them, but they're certainly there. So maybe add a little bit more fun in the mix. But the summit of Hagues is it's a cool place because it feels like the northern frontiers of the entire park. You can see all of Glacier Gorge and Long's Peak and stuff to the south, but you can also see the flatter and lower terrain that lies further to the north over there. And then there's also a little, I don't know if this is still an officially active glacier, but at one point it was a glacier, this little snowfield and the tarn that it's leaving behind. So that's a nice little touch for Hagues. And there is a curious repeater antenna thing on top of the summit of Hagues that I believe is used by the Park Service. So there's a fun little fact for you there. And it is the highest peak in all of the Mummy Range in this immediate area. And again, the particular day on which I did this, again, this is partly subjective ratings, so there's going to be a bit of bias in that, but it was just a beautiful, beautiful day in the park, and I really enjoyed the day that I got to spend up there with the wildflowers and peak summer, like I said. Um, just wonderful. So for that reason, Hagues is also going to go into B. It doesn't quite deserve the top A spot. I don't think any of the mummies quite do, mostly because all of their approaches are going to be like class two plus, by their standard easiest or technically easiest routes. Now, when you're coming off of Hagues, I came down this particular tundra. This is pretty grassy tundra, very steep. It does get steep there. And the reason for that is because this area, this ridge that comes off of the west side of Hagues Peak was actually pretty well snowed in. So I didn't really want to deal with that. But this is probably the more standard route. And I think you could also get some class three if you came up or down this ridge and then wrapped back around, and then you meet the trail again, and then you ascend out or you descend back on a trail that is in fairly good shape. I guess I'll give an honorable mention to Row Peak here. So this is really, I don't know. It's a named peak, but it's really like just a sub peak on this kind of north ridge of Hagues Peak. So I have never actually climbed it, but not really a super unique or notable peak at all. I would say I would probably, if I did it, my guess is I would put it in D tier, but figure just mentioning because it's right there. So there you go. That is all the 13ers in Rocky Mountain National Parks and the Indian Peaks Wilderness reviewed. There you can see the entire crest of it going south to north along the Continental Divide. That is all of them in that view right there. So, one last thing I want to do before I go here. I do have an S tier on this little tier list that I have not been filling in. And I'm going to put my absolute top three in this little group here. The cream of the crop, if you have one day in the mountains of northern Colorado, go and do one of these. No question. Ignore all the other ones. Go and do one of these. And the first one, without a doubt, is going to be Lawns Peak. Lawns Peak is just a classic. It's a 14er. It's got routes every conceivable way. It is one of the classic mountains in the United States, and there is no way it would miss out of this very tip-top tier. So that's Lawns Peak. Let's see. So the other two I would put in there, I would also throw McHenrys Peak in there. In terms of the Glacier Gorge area, all of these 13ers are really something special in this area. But McHenry's in particular, I think just the fact, like the approach from Glacier Gorge, the fact that you get up to this other very rarely seen part of the park over here, that's kind of to the southwest of McHenry's. There's an awesome view up to this angle that I think really is unique to it. And the scrambling in particular was a really fun challenge. Like I said, it was it was fairly difficult at some points, but it was just a fun challenge. And I had a really fun time
The summit was just a wonderful, great place to hang out. And I think if I had to rate in overall views, McHenrys Peak has such a central location in the entire park that it has sweeping, incredible views of literally every part of the park. And so that just gives it a slight edge above the rest of the crowd. You can see the lawns, you can see south to the south park towards Wild Basin, and then across to the north, even all the way up to the Mummy Range. So it is just a bit better for all that. And last but not least, the final in the top three, S tier, I'm going to give to North Arapaho Peak. Let's move it up there. And I think the biggest thing for me about this is the scramble that you get to do. Well, again, like I said, one of the top three scrambles I've ever done anywhere to traverse up to North Arapaho Peak. Totally solid rock, a blast to climb on and figure out how you're going to get across. If you're a scrambler, this one is probably the number one for you. If you want to avoid the hordes on lawns, though, to be fair, the Arapaho Peaks are still quite busy themselves because they're so close to Boulder and Denver still. But highly, highly recommend. And the views of such a unique area of the largest glacier in all of Colorado really commend this peak even higher. And yeah, I think there's not much more I could say about it. So there is your tier list. Hopefully I will annotate this so you actually know which mountain is which in this little list here, and then uh, I'll leave an image either in the description or maybe I'll tag it along at the end of this video in editing. We'll see. So thanks so much for watching. Um, I hope this was helpful for you. I feel like I spent a really long time talking about these mountains, but I hope my passion for them comes through. And yeah, the amount of time it took me to climb all these and plan out all these climbs and look at all the beta, I enjoy every step of the way from deciding to climb it to scouting out the route to getting to the summit and just having that pure sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. And if you're watching this video and you've gotten that far, you know what that feels like, I'm sure. So I hope I can provide a little bit of a guide on this and make a ranking of these 13ers. Maybe you agree if you've done some of these, and maybe you disagree. So if you have any opinions, put them down in the comments. Say anything you like down there. I'm an open book. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you in probably the next mountain climbing video. So I will talk to you soon.